You are not a bad gardener. You have just been sold plants that were never meant to last past August. One right perennial can do what you keep paying for every spring, without a new price tag. Every spring, the same thing happens. You pull into the garden center parking lot with good intentions and a short list. An hour later, the cart has 3 flats of petunias, a hanging basket, a bag of bloom booster, another bag of mulch, and something colorful near the checkout you did not plan on buying. You drive home, plant everything, water it in, and for a few weeks the yard looks exactly like you wanted. By late July, half of it is heat-stressed, leggy, or just done. By September, most of it is gone. And somewhere in the back of your mind, you already know you will be back in that parking lot next April. Here is the part that nobody at the register explains. That cycle is not a gardening failure. It is a purchasing model. Annuals are engineered for one season. They are meant to be fast, bright, and temporary. The industry works best when your beds start over every year, and most people never stop to ask whether some of what they are buying could simply be replaced by something that does not need to be replaced at all. That is where this video starts. Not with a catalog of rare plants, not with a complicated soil program, just with a different question. What if one spot in your yard never had to be replanted again? Over the next 6 parts, we are going to look at 10 plants, from ornamental perennials to edible trees, that operate on a completely different timeline than the seasonal shelf. Some of them can outlive you if planted in the right place. Some produce food for decades. Some will give you free plants through division, cuttings, or self-seeding. And every single one of them has a specific reason for being here. Not because it looks good in a photo, but because it solves a real problem in a real American yard. We start with 2 plants that most people already know by name, but almost nobody thinks of as financial infrastructure. The first is the peony, not because it is glamorous, though it is, but because of what Penn State Extension put plainly in writing. In the right location, a peony can live well over 100 years. One plant. One well-drained, sunny spot. Over a century of spring bloom without replanting. Here is why that matters practically. A flat of annuals costs $20 to $60 at most garden centers right now. You buy it every spring. Over 10 years, that is $200 to $600 for the same patch of color. A peony typically runs $20 to $50 at the nursery. It blooms strongly by the 2nd or 3rd year, and then it keeps going. Not for a decade, but potentially for the rest of your life. The mechanism is simple. A peony stores its energy underground in a crown, a dense base just below the soil surface, and in thick, fleshy roots that hold reserves through winter. The top of the plant disappears in fall. The plant does not. It is waiting. And when soil temperatures rise in spring, that stored energy pushes new growth back up before most annuals have even left the shipping dock. This is where people go wrong. Because the peony looks delicate, gardeners treat it like one. They move it every few years. They bury the crown too deep. They put it in a partly shaded border because the full sunspot feels too exposed. And then they wonder why it does not bloom and reach for a bloom booster fertilizer. The fix is almost never the fertilizer. The crown needs to sit no more than 1 to 2 inches below the soil surface, shallow enough to read the temperature shift of spring. It needs at least 6 hours of direct sun. It needs soil that drains. Not perfect soil, but not soggy clay that holds water after every rain. And once it is placed correctly, the single most important thing you can do is leave it alone. In the Midwest, Northeast, Mid-Atlantic, and mountain climates where winters are cold enough to give the plant its dormancy chill, peonies are one of the most cost-effective ornamental investments in any yard. Not the right choice for deep shade, wet low spots, or the warmest southern climates without adequate winter chill. But in a sunny, reasonably drained bed, they are nearly impossible to kill once established. Over time, the clump grows wide enough to divide, meaning free plants instead of another nursery trip. Now, structure. A peony fills a clump in a border, 2 to 3 feet tall, 2 to 3 feet wide, with a bloom season of a few weeks in late spring. That is enough to anchor one spot. But a yard has edges, fence lines, empty corners, and long stretches of nothing. That is where the lilac comes in. If the peony stops you from buying annual color, the lilac stops you from buying seasonal shrubs. University of Vermont. Extension states clearly, lilacs can live over 100 years in the right conditions. Those conditions are full sun, about 6 hours per day, and soil that drains. Standing water around the roots leads to root rot. That is the same basic bar as most landscape plants already in your yard. What a lilac returns for its $30 to $70 purchase price is hard to argue with. Spring fragrance strong enough to stop people on the sidewalk. Bloom clusters that cut beautifully for the house. A shrub that grows 12 to 15 feet tall and nearly as wide, creating privacy, screening a fence, giving a bare property line purpose. Early pollinator traffic before most of the garden is awake. And all of that, year after year, without buying anything. The mistake is almost always placement. 4 hours of sun instead of 6. A low corner where water collects. Or pruning it at the wrong time, late summer or fall, which removes the buds already set for next spring's bloom. If you want to prune a lilac, do it right after flowering ends. That gives the plant the entire growing season to set new buds before the next cycle starts. The same logic runs through both plants. The problem is rarely that the gardener is doing something wrong. More often, they placed a permanent plant in the wrong conditions and reach for a product fix instead of a placement fix. Fertilizer does not replace 6 hours of sun. Bloom booster does not fix a drainage problem. One peony clump and one lilac shrub, planted correctly, can cover that same yard space for the next 50 years. The plants get stronger every season. The cost per bloom year drops towards zero. And once you see that math with ornamental plants, one question becomes hard to ignore. If a plant can live 100 years just looking beautiful, what happens when a plant that lives that long also feeds you? That is exactly where this goes next. The peony and the lilac make a convincing case. But they are still ornamental. They give you beauty, structure, and a reason to stop buying seasonal color. What they do not give you is food. That changes the calculation entirely. Because when a plant lives for decades and also produces something you would otherwise buy at the grocery store, the math stops being about spring aesthetics and starts being about household resilience. And that is a different kind of argument for a different kind of plant. Two plants carry this part of the story. One climbs, one stands. Both can outlast the mortgage on your house if you give them what they need. And both are far more forgiving than their reputation suggests, as long as you understand what actually makes them work. The grapevine is the climber. And before you picture a sprawling vineyard in Napa, picture this instead. A plain wooden fence on the back edge of a suburban yard in Ohio, a single vine planted at the corner post, and 20 years of free fruit, natural shade, and a living screen that no garden center product could replicate. OSU Extension notes that grape plants can live 50 to 100 years with proper care. A vine you plant this fall could still be feeding your grandchildren. But here is the part that surprises most people. The grapevine does not fail from neglect in the way you might expect. It fails from too much of the wrong kind of attention. The most common problem in home grape production, and OSU Extension says this plainly, is that vines are not pruned hard enough. Most gardeners see a tangle of woody stems and hesitate. It looks established. It looks productive. Cutting it back feels destructive. But during dormant pruning, you are supposed to remove roughly 90% of the wood from the previous season. Not a trim, not a light shaping. 90%. The reason is biological. Grapes fruit on new wood grown from 1-year-old canes. If you leave everything, the vine pushes energy into excess leafy growth, and the fruit clusters become small, crowded, and prone to disease. The hard prune is not punishment. It is the reset that tells the plant to invest next season's energy into fruit, not canopy. This is a direct reversal of consumer logic. You do not fix a grapevine by adding something. You fix it by taking something away. No spray, no fertilizer, no new trellis will solve a vine that has not been cut back properly. For American backyard growers, Concord-type grapes and other Vitis labrusca varieties are generally suited to USDA zones 5 through 8. They handle a wide range of soils, but need genuine drainage. Not just decent soil, but soil that does not sit wet. Full sun matters for sugar development. A south or west-facing fence is ideal. The structure holding the vine needs to be real, not a decorative trellis from the patio section of a big box store, but something that can carry mature wood weight through a wet fall. First season, you are establishing roots. Second and third seasons, you train the permanent framework, the main trunk, and 2 to 4 horizontal arms along the wire. OSU Extension is straightforward about the timeline. Grapes typically do not reach full production until the fifth or sixth year. That patience is not a design flaw. It is the cost of building a 50-year food system instead of buying a $4 bunch of grapes this week. Once that vine is in production, the return is real. Fresh clusters in late summer, plus whatever you do with the excess. Juice, jelly, dried fruit, or simply giving bags of it away to neighbors. Birds and wasps will take their share, and that is just part of the deal. But a mature, well-maintained vine on a fence or arbor can produce more fruit than most households know what to do with. Now, the apple tree. If the grapevine is the argument for edible structure on a fence line, the apple tree is the argument for the yard itself. And no plant in American garden history carries more of the legacy orchard mythology than this one. Old home orchards with trees more than 100 years old are documented in OSU extension literature. The image is powerful. A gnarled, productive tree that has outlived every owner of the property it stands on. But the apple tree is also where the mythology becomes expensive. Because people buy apple trees the way they buy most plants, by the label. They see a photo of heavy red fruit, read a name like Honeycrisp or Fuji, and bring home a whip in a pot without checking three things that matter more than any cultivar name: sun, drainage, and pollination. Missouri Botanical Garden makes the requirements clear. Full sun for flower and fruit production, deep, loamy, moderately fertile, slightly acidic soil with genuine drainage. Waterlogged clay is not just inconvenient. It will kill the tree through root suffocation before it ever matures. And most apple varieties need more than one tree, or at least a compatible neighbor nearby, for reliable fruit set. Cross-pollination is not a luxury detail. It is a biological requirement. Get those three things right, and the apple tree becomes exactly what the mythology promises: a slow sugar machine. Leaves catch sunlight, roots pull water and minerals from deep in the soil, and each year the woody structure stores more energy for the next season's bloom and fruit. It takes time. A standard apple tree on its own roots will not hand you a harvest in year 2. But a dwarf or semi-dwarf variety on a good rootstock can begin producing in 3 to 4 years. And from that point forward, the math starts working in your direction. An apple tree runs $35 to $100 at most nurseries. That is not a small purchase for a first-time fruit grower, but frame it differently. Supermarket apples average $1.50 to $2.50 per pound. A mature backyard apple tree in good conditions can produce 100 to 400 pounds of fruit in a season, depending on size, variety, and care. Even at the low end, that is real grocery value, year after year, from a plant that does not ask to be replanted. The honest limit is this: apple trees require some attention, dormant pruning to maintain an open canopy, airflow, and productive wood. Occasional pest monitoring, because codling moth, apple scab, and fire blight are real in many parts of the country. Choosing a disease-resistant cultivar, something like Liberty Enterprise or Gold Rush, depending on your region, can reduce spray pressure significantly compared to susceptible varieties. Disease resistance is not glamorous on a nursery tag, but in a humid mid-Atlantic or Midwestern summer, it can be the difference between a productive tree and a constant problem. The grapevine and the apple tree share one underlying truth that the peony and lilac also carry, just at a lower stakes level. The plant is not difficult. The placement is wrong, or the expectation is wrong, or both. A vine planted against a weak trellis in part shade with no pruning plan is a maintenance headache. The same vine on a solid fence in full sun, cut back hard every February, is a productive system. An apple tree bought for its catalog photo, planted in clay, without a pollination partner, without checking its chill hour requirement for your region, that is a $75 disappointment. The same tree, chosen for disease resistance and climate fit, planted in a sunny, well-drained spot with a compatible variety 10 feet away, is the closest thing a backyard can have to a self-renewing food source. You do not need an orchard. You do not need acreage. You need one good fence line and one good spot in the ground. And if the thought running through your head right now is, what if I do not have a big yard? What if I only have a patio? What if my soil is wrong for a standard tree? That is exactly the right question, because the next two plants answer it directly. Not everyone has a fence line for a grapevine. Not everyone has the yard space for a standard apple tree. Some people are working with a 10 by 20 backyard in a city row house. Some have a concrete patio and two south-facing walls. Some have decent soil in a small suburban lot. But nothing close to the room, a full-size fruit tree needs to spread its roots and canopy without eventually becoming a problem for the neighbor's fence or the house foundation. This is where a lot of people quietly give up on the idea of backyard food production. They see the orchard photos, do the math on square footage, and conclude it is not for them. That conclusion is almost always premature, because the logic of food-producing perennials does not require scale. It requires the right match between plant and place, and two plants, one that belongs in the ground and one that thrives in a container, make that case better than almost anything else in this list. Start with the pear tree. The pear does not always get the attention the apple does. It lacks the mythology, the variety names that everyone recognizes, the childhood orchard nostalgia. But for a lot of American backyard growers, especially those with heavier, less than perfect soil, the pear is often a more forgiving starting point for a fruit tree. Missouri Botanical Garden gives Pyrus communis a range of USDA zones, 4 through 8, which covers most of the continental United States outside the deep south and the warmest parts of the southwest. It wants full sun and medium moisture in well-drained, humus-rich loam. So far, that sounds like every other fruit tree. But here is the practical difference. Certain pear varieties, including Moonglow, handle heavier clay soils better than most apples will. That does not mean you can plant a pear in standing water. Drainage still matters. But between "my soil is not perfect" and "I cannot grow a fruit tree," there is real space, and a pear can often fill it. The honest part of the pear story is the timeline. Missouri Botanical Garden notes that a variety like Moonglow may not deliver its first meaningful fruit until 4 to 5 years after planting. That is not a short wait. But context matters here. You are not buying a product that delivers this season. You are building a tree, a woody structure that will get stronger, more productive, and more rooted with every passing year. The pear you plant this fall will still be feeding someone in 2050, assuming it goes in the right spot. That spot needs to include pears need cross-pollination to set reliable fruit, which means two compatible varieties planted within range of each other, and the bees that move between them. This is not complicated once you understand it. It is just the biological requirement of the plant. It cannot fertilize itself. Think of it as designing a small system, not buying a single object. Two semi-dwarf pears in a modest yard can share the same pollination window and together produce enough fruit to fill a kitchen counter for weeks in late summer. Semi-dwarf and dwarf rootstocks are worth mentioning here. A standard pear can reach 25 to 30 feet tall and 15 to 20 feet wide over its lifetime, not suitable for a tight suburban lot. A semi-dwarf stays more manageable, often in the 12 to 15 foot range depending on the rootstock and training. That is a fruit tree that fits a real backyard without eventually shading out the vegetable garden, heaving the sidewalk, or triggering a conversation with your HOA. Fire blight is the honest warning for pears. It is a bacterial disease that moves through the orchard on the same bee wings that bring pollination, and it can devastate a susceptible variety in a wet spring. Choosing a resistant variety, Moonglow, Harrow Sweet, Seckle, or Harrow Delight, depending on your region, is not optional. It is the first decision. A beautiful pear in a fire blight-prone area, planted as a susceptible cultivar, is a tree you will be managing or eventually removing. A resistant variety in the same spot becomes a productive tree with minimal intervention. One pear tree, or ideally two, planted in a sunny, reasonably drained spot. That is backyard food infrastructure for a family that does not have room for an orchard, but wants real fruit from real soil. Now, the fig. And this is where the container changes the conversation entirely. Most plants suffer in containers. Their roots hit the walls. The soil dries too fast, or holds too much moisture depending on the weather. They can never quite establish the root depth that keeps them stable through a hot summer or a cold winter. Containers are often a compromise, not a strategy. The fig is a legitimate exception. In the right climate, USDA zones 8 through 10, roughly the deep south, Gulf Coast, California, and the mild Pacific Northwest, a fig planted in the ground will grow into a substantial tree and produce 2 crops of fruit per season, with almost no spray schedule and very little attention once established. OSU Extension notes that figs in those regions often require no sprays at all, and deer typically leave them alone. That is a combination almost no other fruit tree can claim. But for gardeners in zones 5, 6, and 7, the Mid-Atlantic, the Midwest, New England, the Upper South, a fig in the ground gets killed to the roots in a hard winter. It may come back from the base, but reliable fruit production becomes a constant battle with climate. This is where the container flips from compromise to strategy. A fig in a large container, and large means at least 18 inches in diameter, ideally working up to a 15 to 25 gallon pot as the plant matures, can be moved. In summer, it sits on a south-facing patio or against a warm brick wall where it soaks up full sun and generates the heat it needs to ripen fruit. Before the first hard frost, you roll it into an unheated garage, a basement, or a protected space. The plant goes dormant. It does not need light during dormancy. It just needs to stay above about 15 to 20 degrees Fahrenheit. Come spring, it comes back out, breaks dormancy quickly, and begins another season of growth and fruit. That mobility is the advantage. You are not fighting the climate. You are working around it. Fresh figs are one of the more expensive items in an American grocery store, on the rare occasions they even appear. Often $4 to $6 for a small container, and only for a few weeks a year. A productive container fig in its third or fourth season can produce dozens of ripe figs over the course of a summer. The flavor of a tree-ripened fig, picked the same morning, is genuinely different from anything that has spent days in refrigerated transit, and that gap in quality is part of what gives the plant its value beyond the raw dollar comparison. The management requirements are real. A container fig dries out faster than an in-ground tree, so watering during summer heat needs to be consistent. Not daily flooding, but not neglect either. The pot itself needs drainage holes that actually work. Roots will eventually circle and crowd, which means repotting every few years, or doing some root pruning to keep the plant healthy and the container manageable. Fertilizing lightly during the growing season helps, but overfeeding pushes leafy growth at the expense of fruit. The variety matters too. Brown Turkey and Chicago Hardy are two of the most reliable choices for container growers in colder climates. Chicago Hardy earned its name through documented cold hardiness in Zone 5, and it will often push new growth from the base even after a hard winter if it was not protected, which means even a container grower who did not move it in time has a second chance. What the pear and the fig do together in this part of the story is answer the space objection. The pear says, "You do not need an orchard, you need a well-chosen tree in the right soil with the right companion." The fig says, "You do not even need in-ground soil if you are willing to manage a container and think one season ahead." Both plants produce food that has a real price at the grocery store. Both operate on a multi-year payoff cycle that rewards, and both belong in the category of plants that, once they are established in the right situation, do not ask to be replaced. That idea, the plant that stays instead of the plant that gets bought again, is the thread running through this entire list. The next two plants take that thread and pull it toward a harder question. What happens when the right plant for the right place also happens to need the right climate, and what does it cost when you get that wrong? There is a particular kind of gardening mistake that does not show up in the first season. The plant looks fine in May. It pushes some growth through summer. It makes it through the first winter, barely, and you tell yourself it is establishing. By the second or third year, it is struggling in ways that no fertilizer or pruning can fix, because the problem was never care. The problem was the address. Climate mismatch is the most expensive mistake in perennial gardening because it plays out slowly. You are not watching a $4 annual flat wilt in August. You are watching a $60 to $150 tree decline over 2 or 3 years, each season requiring more intervention, more protection, more product, until you finally replace it with something that had the right conditions all along. Two plants illustrate this better than any others on this list. One is ancient, drought-tolerant, and capable of living for centuries in the right place. The other is a genuine American legacy tree, productive and powerful, but only if you have the room and the climate it was built for. Both are worth planting. Neither is worth planting in the wrong situation. The olive tree first. There are olive trees in the Mediterranean that are documented at over 1,000 years old. That is not a misprint. The olive is one of the longest-lived cultivated plants on Earth, and in its native conditions, hot, dry summers, mild, wet winters, rocky, fast-draining soil, relentless sun, it needs almost nothing from a gardener once it finds its footing. That story is true and well-earned. The problem is that the story travels faster than the fine print. Missouri Botanical Garden is clear on what the olive actually needs. USDA zones 8 through 10, full sun, fertile and well-drained soil, and a Mediterranean-type climate. That last phrase carries a lot of weight. Mediterranean climate means hot, dry summers and mild, wet winters, a pattern found in parts of California, the Southwest, and some mild coastal areas. It does not describe most of the United States. In zones 5, 6, and 7, which covers a large portion of the country, from the mid-Atlantic through the Midwest and into the Northeast, winters are cold enough and wet enough to push an olive tree well past its survivable limits. Container olive growing in cold climates gets suggested often online, and Missouri Botanical Garden addresses that directly. Growing olive trees as houseplants or in containers brought indoors for winter can be difficult. The plant needs high light, cool but not freezing temperatures during dormancy, and careful water management to avoid root rot in low-light indoor conditions. Some gardeners make it work with real commitment, many do not, and they find themselves replacing the plant every few years, which is precisely the outcome this whole video is trying to help you avoid. If you are in California, Arizona, the Gulf Coast, or a genuinely mild coastal climate in the Pacific Northwest, the olive is one of the most rewarding low-maintenance trees you can plant. Drought-tolerant once established, long-lived, beautiful in structure, and useful for both ornamental and edible purposes depending on cultivar. Arbequina and Koroniki are common choices for home growers, with smaller fruit and reliable oil production. In those climates, an olive is not a risk. It is a legacy plant in every sense. If you are in Zone 6 outside of Cincinnati or Zone 5 in Minnesota, the olive is a beautiful object that will eventually cost you more than it returns. The plant does not care what the nursery tag said or how much you want it to work. It reads the winter, the drainage, and the light. When those three things do not match what the plant was built for, no amount of effort closes the gap for long. The honest version of self-sufficiency gardening includes knowing which plants are not for your yard. Now, the pecan. The pecan is a genuinely American tree in a way that very few cultivated plants are. It is native to the South and lower Midwest, where it has fed wildlife, homesteaders, and indigenous communities for thousands of years. Missouri Botanical Garden lists it as Caria illinoinensis, suited to USDA zones 5 through 9, with full sun, medium water, and deep, fertile, well-drained soil. NC Cooperative Extension notes that pecans can live 80 years or more, with some trees appearing closer to 100 years old. In the right setting, it is one of the most productive nut trees in North America. But the right setting has a specific size requirement that stops most suburban gardeners before they start: 75 to 100 feet tall and 40 to 70 feet wide at maturity. Read that again: 40 to 70 feet wide. That is not a backyard tree for most American homes. That is a tree that needs real land, an acreage, a rural homestead, a large lot well away from power lines, roof overhangs, septic fields, and neighboring property lines. Planted in the wrong space, a pecan does not stop growing when it runs out of room. It grows into the roof. It heaves the driveway. Its roots find the septic system. And then the bill for removing a mature pecan, which can reach thousands of dollars, becomes the most expensive garden mistake in the story. None of that changes what the pecan actually is in the right place, on a half acre or more in the South or lower Midwest, away from structures, planted with a compatible second cultivar for cross-pollination. A pecan tree is a multi-generational food system. Pecans are a calorie-dense, protein-rich, storable crop. At grocery store prices, a good pecan harvest from a mature tree represents real household value, and the shade a mature pecan throws across a property on a July afternoon in Georgia or Arkansas is its own reward. The timing expectation needs to be honest, though. A newly planted pecan will not produce meaningful nuts for several years, and peak production on many trees does not begin until well into their second decade. This is a tree you plant for your family's future, not your next fall harvest. If that timeline works for your land and your planning horizon, the pecan is one of the best investments you can make in deep southern soil. If your yard is 0.2 acres in suburban Nashville with a house on one side, a fence on two others, and a gas line marked with flags in the lawn, that same tree is a future problem, not a legacy asset. The thread connecting the olive and the pecan is not that they are bad plants. They are exceptional plants. The thread is that their value is entirely conditional on match, climate match, space match, and timeline match. When those conditions are met, both trees justify every word of their reputation. When they are not, the gardener ends up spending money replacing something that was never going to work. Or, in the case of a large tree, spending far more money dealing with what grew too big for its situation. This is the part of the self-sufficiency conversation that rarely makes it into the catalog copy. Every plant in this list can be a long-term asset, but an asset and a liability are sometimes the same plant in different yards. Know your zone. Measure your space before you dig the hole. Think about what that plant looks like, not in year 2, but in year 25. The last two plants on this list demand exactly that kind of thinking, and they reward it more fully than almost anything else you could put in the ground. If the olive and the pecan taught one lesson, it is this: a legacy plant is only a legacy in the right hands, on the right land, with the right expectations. Take that lesson seriously, and it does not scare you away from large, long-lived trees. It prepares you to choose one that actually fits. The final two plants on this list are both nut trees. Both produce food with genuine caloric and nutritional density. The kind of food that stores, that travels, that fills a pantry shelf, and holds value in a way that soft summer fruit cannot. Both are native or deeply adapted to American soils and climates, and both reward the gardener who thinks not in seasons, but in decades. But they are not the same plant, and they are not for the same yard. Start with the Chinese chestnut. If you grew up hearing about American chestnuts, the towering native tree that once dominated eastern forests before the blight of the early 1900s wiped out billions of them, the Chinese chestnut is not that tree. It does not grow as tall, it does not have the same ecological presence, and it carries a quieter reputation. But for a backyard or homestead grower looking for a productive nut tree that fits into a real suburban or semi-rural property, Chinese chestnut is often the more practical answer. Missouri Botanical Garden lists Castanea mollissima for USDA zones 4 through 8, a wide range that covers most of the eastern United States, the Midwest, and parts of the Mountain West. It reaches 40 to 60 feet in height and spread at maturity, which is significant but far more manageable than a pecan. Full sun, medium water, and well-drained soil are the standard requirements. It is the nut tree that fits the middle ground, large enough to be a real landscape presence, small enough that a half-acre lot can accommodate one or two without the tree eventually consuming the entire property. The crop itself is worth understanding. Chestnuts are not like other nuts. They are low in fat compared to walnuts or pecans, high in complex carbohydrates, and were historically used as a staple food, roasted, ground into flour, boiled or dried for long-term storage. A productive Chinese chestnut tree in full bearing can drop hundreds of pounds of nuts in a good year. At farmers market prices, where chestnuts regularly sell for $4 to $6 per pound in fall, that harvest represents real economic value on a property that might otherwise just have grass to mow. There is a pollination requirement here too. Chinese chestnuts benefit strongly from cross-pollination, which means planting at least 2 trees, ideally different cultivars, within range of each other for reliable nut set. This is not optional if you want a consistent crop. One tree will produce some nuts, but 2 trees planted 30 to 40 feet apart will produce noticeably better yields across both. The practical warning is one that applies to any tree in the 40 to 60 foot category. Plant it where it can grow, not under power lines, not crowding the house, not in the corner of a small city lot where it will eventually dominate the entire yard. The Chinese chestnut is not a patio tree, but on a proper homestead parcel, a rural property, or a larger suburban lot where the mature size can be accommodated without conflict, It is one of the highest calorie food plants you can establish in temperate North American soil. It also feeds wildlife. Deer, turkeys, squirrels, and many other animals will work the drop nuts in fall, which makes a Chinese chestnut a dual-purpose planting on hunting land or a wildlife-friendly homestead. The tree produces without the spray schedule that stone fruits and apples often demand, and once established in well-drained soil in a sunny location, it is a remarkably low-maintenance producer. Establishment takes time. Do not expect a meaningful nut crop in the first 3 years. The tree is building roots, trunk, and scaffold branches, the structure that will hold decades of production. By years 4 and 5, a healthy tree in good conditions should begin producing enough nuts to make the harvest feel real. By years 8 to 10, you are looking at a genuinely productive tree that does not need to be replanted, replaced, or tended with the same intensity as annual or short-cycle crops. Now, the black walnut. Everything about the black walnut is larger, longer, and more complicated than the Chinese chestnut. And yet, it belongs on this list because it represents the outermost limit of what a legacy plant can be. Not just a food source, and not just a shade tree, but a living asset that increases in value with every decade it stands. Missouri Botanical Garden describes Juglans nigra as preferring moist, organically rich, well-drained soils in full sun. It develops a deep taproot that makes it difficult to transplant once established, which means you are choosing its location for good. It is native to the eastern United States and much of the Midwest, and it is genuinely adapted to those soils and climates in a way that few cultivated trees can claim. The nuts are edible, intensely flavored, harder to crack than English walnuts, and historically valuable as a food source across indigenous and settler communities throughout the eastern half of North America. A mature black walnut produces nuts in significant quantities, though the USDA Forest Service notes that the best seed production typically begins around 30 years of age and can continue for another 100 years beyond that. This is a tree measured in human generations, not garden seasons. That timeline is both the plant's greatest strength and its most honest limitation. If you plant a black walnut today and you are 35 years old, you may see meaningful nut production from it in your 60s. Your children will see its peak. Your grandchildren will stand in its shade and eat its nuts without ever having bought them at a store. That is what a legacy plant actually means at its fullest expression. Not a plant that outlives a few seasons of annuals, but a plant that outlives the person who planted it and keeps working for the people who come after. The cultural and toxicity note cannot be skipped. Black walnut produces a compound called juglone from its roots, leaves, and husks, a natural chemical that is toxic to many common garden plants. Tomatoes, apples, blueberries, and many other food and ornamental plants will decline or die if planted within the root zone of a black walnut, which can extend significantly beyond the canopy drip line. This is not a rumor or a gardening myth. It is a documented allelopathic mechanism. Before planting a black walnut, know which plants are nearby and plan accordingly. Juglone-tolerant plants, most grasses, corn, beans, carrots, and many native species, can coexist with the tree without trouble. The timber value is real and significant. Black walnut wood is among the most prized hardwoods in North America, used in furniture, gun stocks, and cabinetry. A mature black walnut on a property is a financial asset in the most literal sense, one that some landowners treat as part of their estate planning rather than their gardening hobby. For a small suburban yard, the black walnut is not the answer. Its mature size, its juglone chemistry, and its multi-generational payoff timeline make it a plant for land. Real land, managed with intention, passed down through families who understand what they planted and why. But for someone with acreage, a rural homestead, or a property where the goal is not a tidy seasonal garden, but a living system that feeds and shelters and builds value over time, the black walnut is one of the most powerful plants you can put in American soil. That is the range this list covers, from a peony clump in a sunny border to a black walnut on a rural half-acre, from a container fig on a city patio to a Chinese chestnut dropping nuts on a homestead lawn in October. The scale changes. The logic does not. Right plant, right place. Long enough timeline to let the system build. That is the entire... And the final part of this story is about what happens once you start thinking that way. Not just about individual plants, but about the whole yard. Most yards in America are organized around maintenance. Mow the lawn, pull the weeds, buy the annuals, replace what died. The garden is something you service, not something that works for you. What this list has been building toward is a different model, not a perfect garden, not a no-work garden. That promise is always false. But a garden where the foundational plants have enough lifespan, enough root depth, and enough biological momentum that the system starts carrying more of its own weight over time. The peony does not ask to be replanted. The lilac does not need seasonal color refreshes. The grapevine, once trained and pruned properly, comes back to the same framework every spring and adds to it. The apple tree builds its fruiting structure year by year. The pear gets more productive as its root system deepens. The fig in its container survives winters, you manage it through, and rewards summers, you leave it in full sun. The olive, in the right climate, outlives every product you would have bought to maintain something less suited to the soil. The pecan and the chestnut and the black walnut work on timelines that make every annual purchase look like rounding error. None of these plants ask for much once they are placed correctly. What they ask for is the right location, enough patience to let establishment happen, and the willingness to stop reaching for a product fix when the real solution is a placement decision. That shift, from buying fixes to choosing right, is the most practical thing this video can leave you with, because the spring spending cycle is not going to stop on its own. Garden centers are not going to stop selling fast color. Nursery catalogs are not going to stop photographing zone-inappropriate trees in beautiful light. The industry runs on replacement, and replacement runs on the assumption that your garden starts over every year. It does not have to. One peony in a sunny, well-drained bed, one lilac on a fence line with 6 hours of light, one grapevine on a solid structure, pruned hard every February, one apple tree chosen for disease resistance and cross-pollination, not catalog aesthetics. These are not dramatic moves. They are quiet ones, but they compound. A yard with 10 well-chosen perennial plants, food and ornamental both, is a yard that costs less every year instead of more. It asks for less intervention as the root systems mature, less water once establishment is complete, less product because the plants are not fighting their conditions. It also produces more structure, more food, more pollinator habitat, more of the kind of yard that does not need to be rebuilt from scratch next May. The gardener who plants a Chinese chestnut on a homestead today is not thinking about this fall. They are thinking about the harvest their kids will carry in from the yard without paying for it. The person who puts a container fig on a south-facing patio and moves it into the garage before frost is not making a compromise. They are building a mobile food system that fits their actual space. That is self-sufficiency at the scale most people can actually reach. Not a farm, not a survivalist compound. Just a yard that keeps showing up, season after season, with less effort and more return, because the plants in it were chosen to last. The cheapest plant is never the one with the lowest price tag. It is the one you only have to buy